So this is Destroy Artifact Episode 2. It's a podcast really centered around creativity, which for us manifests itself mostly in tabletop RPGs. So I want to talk today, James, and I want to tell you that I have this happen to me a lot because it's your superpower, and that's not a bad thing. But I want to talk about when someone tells you, hey, I like your idea. It reminds me exactly of A, B, and C in X, Y, Z.
Exactly.
It can be deflating.
Yeah.
Because you're, I don't know. Just, why don't you jump in here? What do you think about this?
So I feel like it's an important thing to realize, and this is something that I learned from you because of the how many times it's happened.
Because the consistent amount of times you're like, hey, that reminds me of that show I watched. And
exactly. Like, oh, you must have seen that too. And you're like, no, but okay. That ideas aren't always that original. Now, when I say that, like I said, I mean, that's just a tip you gave me. I feel like, I don't know, I that's going to happen. Like, I see that in other places. It's not just when people tell me ideas, but if I watch a show and I watch another show, it's easy to say, oh man, that seems heavily influenced by that. And this doesn't happen all the time, but I'm like, this is something you see everywhere. One of the best examples is the Joseph Campbell Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Yep,
it's called,
the
right?
monomyth, yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, the monomyth. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, that person, like Joseph Campbell basically distilled it to like, no, this is like what everything is, more or less. A lot of things are this.
Right. Legends are made up of these sort of linchpins, no matter what continent, no matter what tribe.
But I feel like that doesn't matter. The fact that you can bring it down to what could be considered by some, a formula, doesn't make things that use that, whether on purpose or on accident, any worse.
Sure.
As long as they're good. You know?
Right.
I don't think that is what the sort of quality of your story or your RPG or your campaign or anything isn't predicated upon the fact that you came up with it first.
Sure, I agree with that. And I have like a gabajillion things I want to say all at once. I've got all these things that I'm just like, man, I've been thinking. Yeah. So here's the first thing. The first thing is, this is really focused on when it comes to creative media. I think especially like movies, books, television, tabletop RPGs, the games you run. But this isn't as prevalent in music. Meaning, if I say, okay, let's say what makes up a song. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a certain number of chords and a certain progression with a melody over it and lyrics and so on. So if I take two heavy metal songs and I describe them to you, not play you the songs, but I describe them to you and say, okay, well, both of these songs use downpicking. They have an intro that's about 30 seconds long with clean guitar, and then they come in, it's very strong, percussive drums, and then it's a song about, I don't know, give me a song subject. Heavy metal song subject.
Yo
Mammy died.
Yo Mammy died and now she's the devil.
Okay, so Yo Mammy died and now she's the devil.
But I would even say that the lyrics in this analogy to me are like, don't matter as much. Maybe they do.
Well, I would say that, but maybe they do, maybe they don't. I guess what I'm saying is, I think they would matter. Because, like, Dave Mustaine lyrics aren't the same as James Hetfield lyrics. And if they have the song of similar... But
if you're
that's what I'm getting at.
That's what I mean, because I'm like, you're not telling me the lyrics, you're telling me the idea. I'm like, yeah, they're talking about, broad strokes, the government, and how it's bad.
Perfect. That is a real example. Also, Yo Mammy is the devil.
Also, Yo Mammy is the devil
on Capitol Hill. Yo Mammy is the devil on Capitol Hill.
Wow.
But that's actually a great point, and it kind of brings up what I'm saying is a Metallica song using even the same amps and guitars, using a lot of the same quote-unquote broad strokes.
Tuning is another good one.
Right.
The same tuning, the same meter. A lot of things in music that are like, no, I mean, I can take a lot of different songs. I mean, from through the ages, like literally from the 1800s to now, and say these songs share these similarities.
Correct.
But they're not even close. I'm like, the amount of songs that are in 4/4 that sound nothing like each other.
Right, and why? And there are certain songs that sound very similar, and they get ribbed for it. I think for a long time, there have been certain songs that sound like other songs.
Yeah, but to go on a quick segue, the way I heard someone explain that, why all pop music sounds the same, they do it on purpose, which makes sense. You know, they use some of those bits of the formula. But the reason is because the reason this person said, is when you hear it, it sounds familiar. And I never thought of it that way. But if you hear a brand new pop song,
right,
and you're like, oh, you know, you're really getting into it, part of it might be because psychologically you've heard something like that before.
Sure.
And I think maybe not in this conversation, that holds some merit. Because they're different, obviously, these pop songs, but they feel familiar enough that you get into them a little more, even if you don't realize it.
Sure.
I think that can be applied to creativity.
I think so. And especially what I'm getting at is, I feel like before we go past the first level, ideas in a creative environment, especially like, you know, two writers talking to each other, or two filmmakers, or two whatever, I feel like the idea, in my experience, is more scrutinized quickly than if we were talking about music. If I were saying to you, like, hey, man, I want to take this kind of epic song. It's like a slow burn. I wanted to start off with like a clean, you know, it kind of goes through, and we wait a while to do the chorus, and it's about the government.
It's less likely that I would say, you know, that reminds me of a Jimmy Eat World song where they do the same thing.
Correct. And I don't know why that is, but I feel like it is, I don't know.
I think, well, a few things. One, I've never heard somebody, now I haven't been in a band, but I've never heard somebody say, I've mapped out the song. You know, like in the same way that people love sharing ideas, if I'm writing a song, I'm going to play you part of the song, but it's unlikely that I would say, hey, I have an idea for a song, and then next week I'm going to play you part of it. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like it's almost as though if people didn't give you the idea, but gave you the first chapter first, this would happen a lot less.
Sure.
Because they wouldn't say, oh, that sounds just like BioShock. They'd say, oh, this is really cool.
Right. So now I have played in a band, and I can tell you that sometimes we did do this, where you're like, yeah, man, I really kind of want, we would call like a slow burn would be something like Sad But True by Metallica.
Yeah.
It's just cooking. Or like Dead and Bloated by
Stone Temple
Pilots. The Stoned Temple Pirates. That was their original name.
Oh, that's our new module that's coming out.
The Stoned Temple Pirates. Coming soon from Blabsalute Blabel Blob. Anyway, I wanted to really talk about this because there have been ideas that I was extremely happy with, that I thought, oh, this is it. This is the key. I'm really happy that we thought of this. And then I'll share it to you. And if you're not the one who does it, someone else immediately, and I don't think that this is necessarily a negative thing, but it can be deflating.
That's a good way to put it.
When you feel like, oh man, I thought that this idea, not even that it was original in my head, but it's inspiring me at the moment.
Yeah, you were like, this is really cool. I love this idea. It's hard. You said deflating is probably the best word for somebody to come and say, oh, have you been playing a lot of Dark Souls recently? That sounds just like that.
Right.
And you're like, I've never played Dark Souls.
That's my favorite thing when it happens. Is like, I've never played that before. Like, or I don't know that.
But I guess what I mean is the reason it would be deflating in that case is because you're like, I feel even worse because I didn't accidentally copy them. You know, you're
right.
Like,
it's like
it
you're
wasn't
like, no.
oh, I dreamt about it. It was like,
right.
I've never even played Dark Souls, but I'm sad that there were possibly so many parallels or that it made you think of that.
Correct. So that was one thought, and I kind of wanted to, give you a couple other examples. One other thing I was going to tell you, and then I have another, that's sort of an exercise. But I've learned to have thick skin with this, and I've learned that most of the time it's a compliment.
Yeah.
Before, I don't know that I saw it as that. Before, I think I saw it as
throw it away and start over.
Yeah, like I
accidentally made BioShock.
Right.
Whoops.
And it's like what I have come to learn is because I wasn't inspired by that exact thing, the fractal path that I take is going to absolutely exponentially change. And when the details start filling in, it won't even be in the same neighborhood.
And I think that you asked a question at the beginning. You said, okay, is this a bad thing? I don't think it's a bad thing. And I see that's what you're getting at. But if you're listening, I want you to consider that if somebody ever tells you that is a good, try and think of it like a compliment. Because the other thing that means is if you tell me this kind of fairly I wouldn't say complicated, but you give me the broad strokes of what you're working on. I say, that sounds a lot like Dark Souls. Especially if you've never seen it, you can kind of maybe go play Dark Souls and get some more ideas because you're like, oh, you found something that is a lot like the thing I want to make. And as long as you're not like, oh, I'm going to make the Knight Gwyn. I'm like, no, that is a guy from Dark Souls.
Right.
Basically, and this is another thing that goes around a lot is, what is it? Artists steal, or there's a better way to put that. What is it? Like all artists steal or all artists derivative kind of thing.
Right.
Where there's nothing wrong with it because there is a big difference. It's a very clear line between I am using this for inspiration and I am literally ripping it off.
Sure.
Big difference.
And I think that kind of leads into the next thing, which is if you specifically look to something for inspiration, if you're not doing it in a rip-off, lazy way that's plagiarizing someone's hard work, by you describing it, you're going to come across the things that you would change.
Yeah.
And it'll sort of naturally start evolving. And I love this because there are plenty of examples in my last 3 months where I'll go, we're part of the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group. We didn't say it at the beginning of the podcast, but James and I, obviously, we're Tabletop Terrors, but together we are half of Absolute Tabletop, which is our independent publishing company. And in the Absolute Tabletop group, we fostered an environment where it's like, yeah, share your ideas. This is a positive place. We'll help each other. I'll see amazing ideas and I'll be like, wow, that is really clever. And then the person who posted it tells me what the inspiration was.
Yeah.
And if I'm very familiar with the inspiration, I'm like, I don't think so.
Exactly, because they may have been inspired by that, but that could literally mean taking one single thing.
Right.
Literally, you're like, okay, so BioShock is a good example. BioShock is a game where there's an underwater city that has sort of fallen apart, and you go there in the game. Well, there are, thousands of things that make up BioShock, but I gave you the broad strokes. So if you told me, I want to have an underwater city that's dilapidated, I'm like, that sounds a lot like BioShock. But if instead you said,
It also sounds a lot like Atlantis.
Exactly.
So let's not forget,
That's exactly. But the important thing being, if you instead were like, you know what, I love BioShock, but the one thing I like the idea of is that they have these syringes that change their genetic makeup to give them powers.
Right.
Now, basically, if you gave it, took that and you're like, all right, well, now they live on the moon and it's a colony and there are aliens and 100 other things that were inspired from 100 other things. And then you're like, yeah, but I was inspired by BioShock in part for this. And then you might even, because you love BioShock, you might be using the dilapidated city, but instead of being underground, now it's on the moon because that's where yours took place. And like you said, it's the way you described it as a fractal pattern. It's like, no, that's the perfect way to put it. Because if you picked one thing from all of your favorite things and put them together and came up with a story, you'd never be able to tell what was what.
Exactly.
Because even though you took those things, like you said, it's going to evolve.
Well, and I'll even take it a step further. Because, again, we're not recommending that you just go and say, and I'm going to take a piece of this, and a piece of this. Because that will probably feel disjointed, bloated, and it won't have a through line as far as the tone goes.
Exactly.
It'll be like, that's kind of
That's certainly not a good formula of creating something.
Correct. But at the same time, given enough distance and time, like let's say I did that, and I'm like, okay, well, I really like... Because I didn't play a lot of Dark Souls, but one of the things I love about that game that I saw with you playing it, there's a sense of being tiny in the world.
Oh, yeah.
It's open world in the sense that there's not this particular pattern of, okay, it's time to be in this zone where all these enemies are, your level. It's like, no. There are things that can kill you roaming the land. And if you happen across their path, they will eat you.
Exactly. You can try to fight them, but, well...
And so, okay, let's say I take that concept. Okay? Now, that's not specific to Dark Souls.
Not at all.
But then I say, okay, I really like, in the show Stranger Things, there's an alternate world called the Upside Down. Okay? I'm going to just keep this super basic. What should we call it? The Darkness?
Sure.
I'll even make it better. We'll call it the Other Place.
Sounds good.
Okay? Now I just merge those two things together. I make a couple paragraphs of notes. Now, I'm not looking to rip this stuff off. I'm not like, well, let me search the internet for some things I can hijack. but I'm inspired by those things.
Those are the things, you saw those things, and that's what you thought were cool, so you put them on the paper.
Right.
But then you do that, whether you do that from your own mind or you do it directly even more, that keeps happening.
Exactly.
Because it's rare that I come up with an idea and I think, wow, out of nowhere, I just came up with a really cool idea for my favorite antagonist. 9 times out of 10, if not literally 100% of the time, I will see or hear something that may or may not have to do with fiction or fantasy or
it could be
whatever.
Anything. It could be real world politics.
I could be driving and think, man, that guy cut that guy off and they almost died. Oh man, that gave me a crazy idea for a character. Now, that's obviously a little different because I'm like, oh, I'm ripping off the story of that guy cutting that guy off. But it's like, inspiration is, to me, seeing something, hearing something, smelling something even, tasting it, touching it, and it giving you some sort of idea, whether you use it now or use it later, or if it makes you think and that links to something else. You know, it's like, to me, there's no way to be inspired without other media, without other things. So nothing's original.
It's true. And so to kind of take it back to the very first part of this, because that was a big conversation about sort of doing it by design.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I'm going to...
Like, even if you did it.
It's like not like you're looking to do it, but the thing that strikes you and goes, oh, that's awesome.
And I guess that's what I mean, is that, to me, is inspiration. You're not saying, what can I take from this thing? You're saying, oh my god, I just beat BioShock. It was some of the most fun I've had. The twists and turns were amazing. I'm really inspired by that right now. I wanna make something. I'm not saying I want to make something like BioShock, but I want to make something. And like you said, you're like, all right, so I like that, it was dilapidated, a little bit post-apocalyptic, very much its own, like, there's no police, there's no government. And like you said, that's not specific to that. No. I mean, I can come up with 100 things. I could have just as well played a different game where the same thing happened. I'm playing Mad Max, and I get the same thing. I start in the same place now. Mm-hmm. So, like you said, you're not doing it by design, but like that's how my brain works. That's too. Like, I'm not saying I want to take this, but I'm like, that's inspiration.
And let me tell you the craziest thing. This is really what brought up this whole concept, is because I've experienced this more than someone saying, hey, that reminds me of BioShock. Yeah. Let me take you down the path of what happens. I'm going to use your exact example. I'm inspired by BioShock. I want to make this place that has no laws, everything you just said. But like you said, I'm going to take it and go, you know what, though? Mine's on the moon.
Yeah.
Now, in my mind, what I did was I'm like, oh, how can mine be different? I don't want to copy. What interests me? And I go scouring for this unique identifier. Oh, what could it be? I don't want it to be underwater. Okay, yeah. I'm seriously going to put mine on the moon, and this is how it's going to go. When I share that idea, more often it's, oh, like such and such, because they are pinpointing the thing that's on the moon.
Exactly.
So I don't get called out for like, oh, that sounds a lot like BioShock on the moon. I get like, listen, our community and even tabletop RPG players in general, most of them are just ferocious readers.
Yeah.
Like, they read a lot. So there's going to be a lot of ideas floating around in their head. And I'll get, oh, that reminds me of so-and-so's book, the third in the series on such and such.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it really kind of started out as BioShock. And to me, the moon part was the part I thought was different.
Exactly. And in the same respect, to sort of go in the other direction with that, by having a unique identifier like the moon, you immediately introduced a bunch of other, we'll say, problems that you have to solve and come up with reasons for. So it's like, in that case, you're right. You're like, okay, so, they say, hey, this sounds like that. But you're like, okay, that doesn't really mean anything to me. You know what I mean?
Right,
if somebody does tell you that, like you said, so you were given a compliment. Somebody said, something I like, and you're getting close to that. Perfect. But in the other way, you're like, all right, now that it's on the moon, it can't be the same. And you don't want it to be. But the idea is now you're coming up with different ideas because you're like, okay, well, I have to solve the problems of being on the moon.
Yes.
I have to figure out how that happened and why. And then suddenly you're going, this is one of those fractal patterns where you're going off in your own direction. And you may, in 6 months, not even remember that the idea came from BioShock.
Exactly.
And it's like, that's how ideas are created. That's how things become. And it doesn't matter. Even if you told people, yeah, you know what, when I started, I had just beaten BioShock and I was really inspired by it. Like you said earlier, just like you do, you're like, yeah, but you're not even close to that anymore.
Exactly. And let me tell you what I love about working with everyone in Absolute Tabletop. Because it's me, James, our buddy Matt, and our buddy Barker. And what I get to do is I have this, first of all, I have you as a sounding board, and I go, hey, I'm thinking of this dystopian city on the moon, and I describe it. Now, James is really good about it. He's not negative, but he goes, oh, okay, that, I don't want to burst your bubble. That sounds a little like BioShock. And I go, yeah, but I want to do X and Y different. He goes, no, as long as you just know, like, he's kind of just my first litmus test.
Yeah, I'm the informative, like, hey, just
someone else is going to say this.
I like to be the one that tells you you have spinach in your teeth so that later you're not like,
right,
why didn't anybody tell me?
So when I got a booger in my eyebrow, James is like, you got a booger in
Because there are some cases, just as a quick tangent, there are some cases where you or someone else will explain something to me, like a long thing, and I'll be like, listen, I don't know if you know about this, but that is literally this with two things different.
Right.
And I'm like, you may have just come upon that, and I mean, to me, that just means you had the same thought process as whoever that person
and
is.
that's the thing, is that
when that happens,
I would say like, 8 times out of 10, maybe 9 times out of 10, I'll really be like, oh, really? I had no idea. Sometimes I'll be like, no, yeah, that's kind of where I got it from.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
But, so you're the first pass, the first filter. But then when I share it with Barker and Matt, I can choose to or not, but I'll usually just go, hey, this is what's inspiring me. I want to do this dystopian society on the moon. And they start asking what ifs.
Yeah.
They start telling me, wouldn't it be cool ifs? Oh, dude, you know what'd be cool? Now, here's the thing. Now they're removed from the original inspiration. Mm-hmm. So whatever, this is where it gets a little crazy. Whatever's inspiring them. Let's say, for Matt, he just told me that a new Magic the Gathering set is coming out that's like this sort of like cool Egyptian based. So what if his mind's on that? He's been looking at concept art and he's been doing, so I don't know that, right? Or I'm not thinking that. So when he goes, oh, it'd be awesome if they find these temples and pyramids on the moon. Now I'm like, oh, dude, that's awesome.
Great idea. Super cool.
Now I'm thinking different temples and pyramids than probably the pictures he's been looking at.
Exactly.
But then Barker comes and goes, hey, and let's say he's been listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, and he's listening about something, specific to a certain region or like the Prussians or whatever. So he goes, oh, it'd be cool if there was a trade embargo on. And so
it'd be cool if they were Prussian.
What if there were Prussians on the moon? 210 Prussian common. My point being is that what is inspiring him at the moment, and then it all kind of comes together, and that's all new to me.
And exactly.
I don't have the frame of reference Matt does. I don't have the frame of reference Barker does. I don't even have the frame of reference you do. Then we kind of throw it all into this ball, have a doc on Google Docs, kind of just ideas, brainstorms, and then it sits for a couple weeks. And then we all go back into it. And none of us remember exactly what inspired us, like you said.
In some cases, even, we don't remember who wrote what. Sometimes I'm like, I don't remember who added the pyramids thing, but that's really cool.
Right.
And I'm inspired by that right now, so I'm going to flesh some of that out.
Right. And then it starts growing further and further and further away until it's this entirely new thing. My favorite thing is when we share something like that, and someone mentions an entirely different thing that we had no idea existed.
Yeah.
Right. So my idea for bringing this up and to talk to you about this is, and just telling everybody listening, your ideas aren't original. Not if you're doing it right.
Exactly.
But how you how you make them exist.
Yeah, because ideas are sometimes I refer to them as the easy part.
Right.
It's the easiest part of the process to come up with something cool in broad strokes. Mm-hmm. But the moment you have to start writing dialogue for a character, it's going to be different than anything you've ever seen.
Yeah.
Because it's unlikely that you're going to write all of the same dialogue.
Right. And so when you have that process, you have to know it's okay, as long as you're not ripping people off, as long as you're not being lazy, as long as you're not going, well, I'm going to mix. Because this is actually something that did happen. I had a guy who was like, hey, I want you to look at my homebrew. And I was like, okay, here's the Google Doc. I went through the Google Doc, and it was cut and pasted from a bunch of other campaign settings online and stuff like that. And you could tell because the fonts didn't change. And some of them had the web links. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, cool. But it was like essentially just this person grabbed a bunch of other people's stuff, threw it into a melting pot. Now, not a problem. That's great. Do that. Have fun. But he was talking about publishing his homebrew setting. And I was like, dude, you're literally ripping off.
That is actual plagiarism.
Right. And even if you edit it and change it, you're taking whole cloth, a full written thing, you're pasting it in a doc in the same font with the same pictures. And it was so disparate and broken because it would go from this thing to this thing. It didn't have its own identity.
Exactly. That is sort of something similar that similar to what we're talking about, but it's it's never a question of, am I doing something wrong? It's like that. That is an obvious thing. It's
if you're asking yourself that, you are.
Exactly.
So, yeah, you have to have that kind of knowing that's like, no, I thought of this. I really am inspired by this.
But it's good to know that the idea is not where the story ends.
No.
So it's the kind of thing where even if somebody tells you, oh, well, that sounds a lot like this, or, oh, did you get that from this? Or even if you begin thinking that yourself, oh, man, is this too close to, the things that were inspiring me? Did I just, take concepts from some of my favorite things?
Right.
And even if that's the case, if you keep going, it will never be the same as anything else.
Nope.
That's how anything that is original comes out. But the ideas can't be. The ideas have been done.
There's nothing new under the sun. And here's the other thing. This is where, to really tie it in with tabletop RPGs, and what a benefit you have, is that if you give this core structure to your players, all of them are going to interpret it differently and want to play through it differently and bring up different points that you probably hadn't considered yet.
Yeah.
So the guy who's like, I want my family to have a farm in that area, what would the crops be? And you're like, oh, I don't know, let me think about it. Well, let's work on that together.
Exactly.
And then all of a sudden it starts shifting and getting its own personality and so on. So yeah, I'm feeling better about that because, like I said, I am just inspired by things and I can't help what I'm inspired by.
Yeah.
My intention is not to rip people off, but to try to take the soul of what inspires me and say, what is Tabletop Terrors version of that?
Yeah.
And how can it change? I wanted to do one other exercise before we jump into, what's hanging us up creatively. So I want you to think about this. Okay, I'm going to tell you something. And I want you to kind of, I don't know, I'm just making this up, so just roll with me.
Okay.
So we start off, and it's this naval battle. All right? And there are these sort of privateers on an island. And they're using muskets to fire over these sort of ruins of an old Spanish fort that's been just decimated by cannonballs. But they're firing these muskets and reloading, and they're, putting their backs against these ruins. And there's a ship, a huge ship that's supposed to be coming in and saving them. Now, they're taking heavy fire from a royal ship that's just firing cannonballs. And this charismatic privateer leader is like, don't worry, our angels are coming, right? Don't worry, we've got this covered. It'll be just, I can see him on the horizon, just stay alive. And then he says, James.
Can I say what he says?
Yeah.
You know how I know we're going to make it?
How?
Because we're too damn pretty to die.
That's exactly what he says. And then, you see that they're just fighting, etc. They're loading their muskets. These cannonballs are flying. These, privateer ships off in the distance are coming. They're coming. And then they start to get smaller, not larger.
They begin to turn around.
And the Royal Navy ships move in closer for the kill. And the Navy takes them prisoner. Now, what show did I just describe?
That's the first scene of Firefly.
Right, the space western.
Space western television show.
So, until I started giving you those cues, were you thinking Firefly?
No, the moment you said,
our angels are coming?
No.
I
was onto it before that, but again, that's my superpower. The moment you said that they were privateers and that there was a royal ship coming in, I thought, that sounds like the beginning of Firefly.
So
the other reason this is my superpower with Tim specifically is because we have a lot of the same tastes and have seen a lot of the same things. I don't think this would work with everybody. Because they're like, yeah, I was describing the Wheel of Time series. And I'm like, well, I know that I've never read that, and neither has Tim. We are very similar, so that also helps.
I was describing Duncan. In,
Dunkin'
Hands
Donuts.
of Our Fathers. The seminal science fiction novel.
Like the one with the Seminole Indians. Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah. But my point is that if I told that story and took out all those cues, even, what I would have gotten was James would say, hey, it's kind of like the beginning of Firefly. And I go, oh, it is. All right, well, that's okay. But, and then we'd start building off of it and brainstorming it. Then I take this battle, and then I bring it to Matt and Barker. Mm-hmm. And then they go, oh, it'd be really cool? And then Barker comes in with like, oh, this royal ship, it'd be really cool if it was a captain who's at his wit's end and he needed to get something on the island and maybe he wanted to work with the privateers. I was like, oh, great. Okay, already we're different.
Yeah.
Then I bring it to Matt, and Matt goes, dude, you know what I was thinking? It would be awesome if on the island they find something that could maybe help them, something that's been lost. And before you know it, now we're not even close to that.
Exactly.
So I wanted to do that on purpose.
Of course. But as well as the fact that even if that's what you went with, granted, if you didn't literally use the lines from the show, even if that's what you went with, and it was, say, an RPG, and you put the characters in the situation of the characters, your player characters, in the shoes of the characters in the show, what they do will be that same fractal pattern. And it's the kind of thing where that one is pretty close, but also the idea of a group of people under fire who are waiting on reinforcements that decide not to come is also common. I mean, that same thing happens in StarCraft. That's how the Queen of Blades becomes who she is. That's, I can probably come up with a few places where I'm like, yeah, but that concept isn't, that's not unique. It's the mixture of that plus space plus Western that makes that scene Firefly.
Exactly. And the way that I would tell it, the things I would focus on, and the words I would put in the characters' mouths, the NPCs, especially if it was a tabletop RPG, mixed with the things that the players would say and focus on.
And whoever their characters are.
Exactly.
It would be, nobody would be able to tell what that was from.
Right. And if they did, it could be like, oh, that's an homage to Firefly. But I like how you've done it here.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just kind of wanted to talk about all those things because there's no way that I can control what inspires me. Mm-hmm. What I can control is if I rip it off or not. And if I really take the time, the effort, and the energy to say, what is the soul? What is the thing that has captivated my attention enough that I want to take and spend my time working on it?
Yeah.
And then what is the manifestation of that I want to make exist? And then I run it through you and we talk about it. And usually, even just talking to you, it gets better.
Yeah.
And then running it through, like I said, and I'm repeating myself for a reason because I also want to point out it's very good if you have at least a support group of like beta readers. Mm-hmm. They don't even have to be people you work with, like on creative stuff, but they need to have your same taste. Yeah. Someone in your audience who's sharp enough to not just be someone who ingests it as a fan, but who can give you that informed critique of what style you like.
Exactly. Because in the same respect, if you said, hey, I have this really cool idea, and you explained a similar situation, but from something that I didn't like much, there's a difference between here's how you can make this idea better, and I'm not really into that style. Those things don't matter. In the case of this, if we're workshopping something, it doesn't matter if it's something I'm into.
Right. Now,
because it's you and I, and it's Matt and Barker, 9 times out of 10, those tastes do overlap, and we are really inspired by it. But even if you came to me with something that, like I said, I wasn't as interested in, I would still be able to say, well, but this is what I think could make it better. This is what I would change, things like that.
No, I love it. So that's, I think, a good thing to remember. Comment on this. If you're listening to this either on iTunes or Podbean or any podcast streaming service, if there's a comment mechanism, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If there isn't a comment mechanism, tabletopterrors@gmail.com. What do you think about all this? If you're listening to this on YouTube, obviously there's the comments below. Make sure to like this, subscribe it. But going into the second half of what Destroy Artifact is, now we're going to just figure out what are we dealing with creatively, what are we working on, what are we struggling with, and kind of go from there. So last time we talked about your Fallout game.
Mm-hmm.
Have you made any mind share on that? Have you gotten any progress mentally, or have you even touched it?
I haven't really touched it. I did go back and read some of my notes, and I remembered some of the things, and I kind of got back into the spirit of it. And I was, like I said in the previous podcast, I listened to the song again that I listened to, and it is very rough now, rough right now, and I haven't really touched it. But
Sure.
I feel like, just like anything, when I do eventually go back to it, all of the things we talked about, whether I realize it or not, will inspire things that happen.
Sure.
Which I think is the beautiful part.
It is, as long as you don't wait too long. Let's take our own advice.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that stuff does dim over time. Yeah. I think that's cool. And the other thing I wanted to mention about that is the creative process has to be iterative, and things can change drastically even at the last minute.
Yeah.
I hear that all the time with like movies that I love or sequel ideas. These people who are making these things that you love, the J.J. Abrams making Star Wars, the specific one I was thinking of is Dan Aykroyd with Ghostbusters. I was reading an article.
Yeah.
The ideas still change as they figure out what they're trying to do. Ghostbusters originally had elements of like time travel and like all this other crazy stuff, but they eventually landed on what they landed on. So for your adventure, you could have to murder your darling at some point and say, you know what, there is no Middletown, there is no vault.
Exactly.
And you have to be okay with making that change.
Yeah.
And saying, yeah, well, this is where it started, but it's all just a stepping stone to get to the finished product. So it wasn't time wasted, and it's not wrong, and you can't go, well, I got to throw the whole thing away. It's like, no. You got to be able to grow with it.
Exactly. Because in that same respect, even if you don't use it, even if I didn't use these ideas for this game, and I did decide, I'm going to nix this, or I'm just, I'm going to change that, that idea isn't gone forever.
Right.
Now, to some degree, you may forget it later, but if I'm working on something later and I'm thinking, what do I want to be here? I'm working on a fantasy thing. I'm doing this. I'm working on something else.
Right.
Just us talking about that will, at least a little bit, give me an idea of, it will inspire me a little bit, and I might use parts of that. And it's the kind of thing where that, that means it was worth it. Even if that thing never saw the light of day back then,
right,
it may, in the future now.
And that's what this is all about, is getting through that emotionally. I know this sounds crazy. Like, I understand that I'm not a soldier and I'm not doing anything life-threatening.
Yeah.
But being creative and having to put yourself out there and do that can be emotionally draining. It can be tiring. It can be just mentally exhausting.
Yeah.
To work on something so long and then go, okay, that was just the journey to get here to the starting point.
Exactly.
And it's like...
That's happened to me enough times to know that, that's part of the process.
Right. So if you're listening out there, it's okay to do that. So James and I have been working on the races. This is what has been kind of getting my brain into a pudding. We're coming out with a campaign guide for tabletop RPGs, specifically Dungeons & Dragons, 5th edition. Our campaign world is called Dragon Grin, and it's a place where evil has won. And we're coming out with this campaign setting guide, and we want it to be different. So I have in front of me a player's handbook, D&D 5th edition player's handbook. We were flipping through this earlier. We were actually doing a video with our mom, and she was kind of coming up with a character idea, which is very new for her and for us. But so James and I have been working on these races, and so the thing that's kind of hanging me up is...
Well, I know that, you really wanted to go, Triple Crown with it, and I was just feeling a little more like Grand Prix seemed more my style for the races of Dragon Grin.
Oh, man. No matter how often we make that kind of joke, I'll always laugh at it. And you can choose any races. I think on a live stream the other day, I was like, 5K. I was just like...
5K, exactly. That's just... I don't know.
Triple Crown. Well, so...
Those aren't even types of races.
No, They aren't a 5K race?
No, Triple Crown is just... It's three... You win the Triple Crown if you win 3 races.
Can I call it a heat?
You can call it...
It's a heat.
It's a heat. It's a
heat.
Oh, there's another word for it. I don't remember.
A meet. We don't know horse racing. Anyway, so in the world of Dragon Grin, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but I kind of wanted to talk to you about this.
I did want to go through 90%.
But I am going to go through all of these. There's a lot, because let me be Let me be clearer for those listening. I'm looking at a Google Doc right now, and it's divided by elves, dwarves, halflings, tieflings, and so on. My thought was, for our book, people can use the races inside of the Player's Handbook for 5th edition.
Mm-hmm.
But our races would replace them. It's not just a reskin. It's a little different. So I'll give you an example. In the Player's Handbook, let's say you go to elves, right? There are subtypes of elves. So you've got a high elf that has a specific kind of flavor, and then different ability score increases and abilities.
Yeah, these are the sub-races.
Sub-races, that's what I should have said. I couldn't find the word. Wood elf and then dark elves. For us, similar. Now this is all as alpha could be. This isn't even wet cement. This is like the powder you use to make cement.
No, this is
the water.
The water that we are eventually going to add to the cement and mix it.
Right. So for instance, instead of, in Dragongrin, instead of a high elf, a wood elf, and a drow. Now you could play any of those. Okay. But in our campaign book, there would be the Talus, also known as the Sky Elves, the Drivy, also known as the Mountain Elves, and the Dorsai, also known as the Drowned Elves. Now, are they analogs to these? Yes. Are they exactly the same? No.
Because it's the sort of thing where, especially to get into the tone of the world, you can just use your Player's Handbook, and like you said, that's fine. I mean,
sure,
you can
and
be
they're
a high
all
elf.
allowed. And we're going to put a note in the guide saying any of these are allowed.
And that's perfectly reasonable. But if you wanted to like really get into the world, you can pick, the Drivy. And it's the kind of thing where while it may be similar, and like you said, you may be able to draw an analog, the tone is going to be completely different. The story is going to be different, and it's going to immerse you in your character a little more if that's something you're looking for.
Right.
With something that, is as simple or, as a sub-race, basically. We want to make sure that you can really latch into something with your characters.
Right. And so I'm going to go through these analogs and kind of talk this through with you and make sure that we're on the right track here. Just for the elves. I don't want to go through all the races, but I kind of want to just say, okay. So the Talus are called Sky Elves because, for me, I think that, there are a lot of tropes where there's like floating islands, the kind of fantasy floating island, which is awesome. But I thought, okay, I don't think that fits exactly in Dragongrin for what we're trying to do. So just swapping something out. We wanted to make it a giant floating tree. Now, I don't mean a tree in Earth. I mean, I think it would be really cool if it was just this gnarled, tangled root system that kind of floats.
Which, based on the rest of our the podcast we've talked about, that reminds me a lot of something I read in a book.
Oh, tell me. Do you remember what book?
I do, yeah. It was from the Hyperion series. There are these, basically, it's a whole thing. Trust me, it's a whole thing. But there are these ships that are world trees, and they're basically big old trees that are ships. It's almost exactly what you're describing. People live in them.
So that's awesome.
They're spaceships and they fly through the air. But the main thing that I loved about those, and I know that you didn't know this, is they're not trees on Earth. They're literally just trees that fly through the air. It's not like this came out of the ground. It's like, no, we made a tree in the air and now it floats.
I love that. And I have never read the Hyperion series.
Yeah.
So,
but it's like that's not a
no, and that's not something. I mean, listen, that's even touching World of Warcraft.
But exactly. What I'm saying is like that the idea of a floating tree is
or Norse mythology.
Close. Yeah, I'm like
from the dawn of when men could write.
So it's like that's perfectly fine. But it's my superpower to tell you, hey,
no, I love
that. Reminds me of this.
Well, so here, just to and this is we're going to talk through this. This is going to be interesting. So for us, I thought it would be really cool is if this floating tree has a purpose. It doesn't just float around aimlessly. It floats in front of the sort of portal or entrance or where the planes are most thin to go into the famous. That guy's really famous.
Is what I thought. I was like, man, I'm trying to think of a joke right now, but because they can't see the word,
it
doesn't work.
Maybe it should just be famous. Anyway, that's a whole nother thing I get hung up on is when a word sounds like another word, and I'm the only one that I know of that really gets hung up on it, so I need to stop all that. So the idea is that this tree is there to guard that entrance. It's a city on purpose. It's like a what do you call it? I always forget this word.
Wait a minute.
When you have a
when
you have a city in another country, it is the emissary. No, the
embassy.
Embassy. Thank you. It's sort of like the embassy from the now.
It's more like the gate.
It's the gate with a city in front of it on purpose to be like, hey, you can come up here kind of if you can make it, but you can't get in here unless it's special.
It's the door. I would say more than anything, they're not leaving the door open. They're like, hey, you want to come through this door?
So now let's take this a step further. I purposefully didn't say Feywild because that is a thing that comes with a bag and 5 boatloads of mythos. So am I being just a little, little baby boy who's like, no, ours is called Orcs with a K. To me, it's a big enough place, it's a big enough thing to where I really want to dance around calling it the Fey Mist.
Well, and I think that's fine because we're using the 5th edition open gaming license, and we're able to use things that exist, and people have an idea. People coming to here will likely have an idea of certain things that exist. It touches a little bit on what we talked about before. It's a little bit familiar to give them something to latch onto.
Right.
Because I would literally describe that as, okay, in Dragongrin, the Fey Mist is kind of like our Feywild.
Exactly.
And I'm like, boom, just 8 boatloads of context. And then you go, okay, well, but this is different, and this is how it's different. But it gives you an idea. Because if we were talking like, you're like, hey, I bought an Audi. And I'm like, I don't know what that is. You're like, oh, it's a type of car. Like, oh, okay. I know what that is now.
I get you. I'm there.
There are obviously differences, but I'm like, okay, but I know what a car is, so we now have a point to start.
Exactly. And so to me, the other thing that's important about this is that, just thinking about it, we are a publishing company. Absolute Tabletop is an independent publisher. And from an intellectual property standpoint, I want to be able to do a lot of stuff with this without having to double check myself against what is allowed.
Yeah, exactly.
And where I can put this word and so on. I don't think Feywild is one of the registered places, but it might be. I know a lot of the plains are.
That's the thing. I think it is, but I might be thinking Shadowfell. No, I'm thinking Shadowfell. I think Shadowfell is.
So we'll get there as well. So that's good. But anyway, so that is hopefully, when you think that, it's just a slightly different thing from a high elf. Because you're already like, oh, wow, well, what would I be? Where would I...
And there would be a description of where they live and more, just like in the player's handbook. Again, just that more stuff to steep yourself in.
Exactly. Like you're already thinking of it from a different perspective. So it's like, well, where would my character fit? How would I fit in this world? So, cool. So that would be kind of like our high elf. The Drivy, also known as mountain elves, we kind of went totally sideways on this. Now, some people might not like this, but the options are there. Instead of them being wood elves, they're mountain elves. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, you want to play, and here's the way we're going to explain this. If you want to play a wood elf, you can. Your voice can crack like you're 10. You can do that, but it would just be you're probably one of the people from Talos who moved down, and there would be settlements that would be considered. So we're going to give in the book, we'll say, hey, here's, if you want to play a high elf, here's pretty much what you'd be. Like this is some ideas for where you'd fit into the world. But I thought it would be cool. And James and I have talked about this, and we want it to be different enough without it being too snowflakey. But what if these
were actual snowflakes? I'm in.
They are. Well, they are like really pale. So what if these mountain elves left the Fey Mist long ago? They totally, they're not into the whole, they're not into all that.
So they left the Fey Mist, right? And they go down in Dragongrin, and they get to Innis, right? And they're like, hey, what's the weather like here? And or what's the weather like back in the Fey Mist? And the Drivy didn't hear him, and he's looking in the mirror, and he goes, so pale.
That was worth the payoff.
I was going to say, that was a long
I was like, oh, please land. Please land.
Please land. Please land. I don't want to have to edit this out.
So, oh no, I'd leave it. See your explosion. So these mountain elves, they left the Fey Mist long ago, and being disconnected from the magics that are such an innate part of what is elven kind, that kind of that fairy and the fae and that sort of
other F words,
you know. We thought it would be their skin turns a pale white, and they're less slight, so they're a little more muscled. And I wanted the idea of a race of elves who carved stone with greater detail and beauty than the dwarves. Maybe not better craftsmanship.
Yeah, not necessarily better craftsmen or better at digging or otherwise, building amazing structures. But if you give them a slab of marble, they're just some of the best in the world.
Exactly. So I thought that would be interesting. So these would be the mountain elves. And they are also, they're going to be a little more muscled, a little stronger.
Probably a little closer to human in that respect, but probably still tall.
Yeah.
Pointy ears.
And I'm thinking like pale skin and like, I was thinking maybe bright colored eyes, like you could do like bright purple or bright blue, something like that.
Yeah.
But already, hopefully, is it different? Is it different just to be different? No. I feel like we were really inspired to say, well, in our world, it would be cooler if in these mountain ranges, these enormous mountain ranges that span the middle of the continent, if these elves purposefully settled there and carved out all these different things.
Yeah, exactly.
I just think that would be way cooler than just sticking dwarves in there.
Yeah, and then we can make a Mount Rushmore on Dragongrin.
Totally. With a big elvish Presley. Oh, gosh. So, if you did want to play a wood elf, like I said, you could still do that. These would replace the wood elves. The Talus would kind of replace, and I say replace, but they would be alternates, variants. Yeah. Variant of variant. James, you actually came up with this one. I didn't think to do this. Do you want to talk a little bit about those fellas? They would kind of replace... Well, I'll let you go. Do you remember this?
Not even kind of.
So here's what happened. James came up with this idea, and then I wrote it down, and he forgot about it. And then I named them, and then now... This is the effect we're always talking about on here. You came up with the idea, and now I'm going to read it to you, and it was your idea, and now it's going to be new to you. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm so ready, because I'm like, okay.
So...
Man... That's cool.
If the Drivy left kind of the elven way and they're like, no, we're going to live in the mountains. We don't want anything to do with the gate to the Fae. Like, that's all you, Talus. And then the Talus elves are the ones that say, well, no, we're going to guard this, and this is our lineage. The Dorsai are the ones who were tasked with guarding the other gate, which is the Shadowfell, or what we call the Desolation. So they were tasked with guarding this gate, and they're in the submerged city that's very, very inspired by Atlantis. Mm-hmm. Aquianus is what it's called. So it rests upon this gate of the Desolation. Now, we think it would be really cool, and James, you're the one who said, oh man, wouldn't it be cool if we didn't have just classic drow in the world, but these underwater elves were like the drow.
Yeah, because we have a very large underground portion of our world. And I do kind of remember thinking, do we want to have a further underground portion where like just drow live?
Exactly.
We kind of wanted to avoid that, I think so.
So are there drow? Probably. I think there would be.
And in the same way that you could play a wood elf, you could play a drow if it fits into into it. But for me, in the same way that you can play all of these, I feel like as if I were the game master, despite the fact that I'm helping write this, I would say, hey guys, I'd really like it if you picked one of the ones from the guide, from the Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrin, because
it fits the flavor.
It'll just add to the story. Now, if you pick a wood elf, there's nothing wrong with that. And you can even just say, I'm a wood elf from the woods in this place. And I'm like, well, this is Dungeons and Dragons, potentially, so you can do whatever you want.
Right, and I'd be super down with that.
It's the kind of thing where it's like, well, it might take away from it a little bit, but it doesn't hurt anything.
No.
So, yeah, I mean, we might have drow, but I'm like, well, these would, in effect, I feel like, be our drow.
So let me tell you, and I'm going to type this in. You're probably going to hear it when I do this. So I want to add this. When out of the water for extended periods of time, the Dorsai begin to... I don't know how to word it, but it's...
become Chorsai.
Oh, Horsai.
Ooh.
No, they begin to exhibit a thick scaling of their skin.
They get ashy.
They get ashy as it dries out. Something like that. Because I like the idea that our drow don't necessarily look like drow, but they look almost like these... And I don't say scaly necessarily like literally reptilian, but these like what a molting snake would look like.
Yeah, exactly. Like their skin is literally drying.
Just really cracked and dry, like just really like those super high quality photos of the desert.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that would be a really cool way to differentiate them, because some of them do leave. Because I like the idea that Aquianis, listen, you put a city on top of the Shadowfell, it's eventually going to fall.
Exactly.
So what I was thinking is that the city fell into disrepair, and now it's a super dungeon in our world. So maybe the upper layers are still barely livable, but dangerous. But I like the idea that, you can even say too that some legends say that they did it on purpose.
Yeah.
To stop a great evil from coming through, to collapse the city. But now, some of them want to get out of there, but it's totally the elves. Excuse me. I don't think the elves would like them because they look at them as traitors.
Yeah, exactly.
And then people wouldn't like them because they look all scaly and everything like that. So where would they go? Probably underground.
Exactly. Or other underwater cities. I don't think we know exactly how this underwater city works, but if they were able to make more underwater cities where they could be accepted, they might do that.
Yeah. And I love that. So that's just an example of kind of what we're doing. So I wanted to, get everyone's thoughts listening. But what are your thoughts on this? Are you liking the direction of this, where it's a court of law, where we're sort of replacing, and not all of them are going to be a one-to-one conversion.
Well,
I think the elves worked out the.
These aren't really. They sort of are, but they're not. Basically, we've done exactly what we've talked about this whole podcast. We did start in a place, the Wood Elves, but when you keep saying that, I'm like, I don't really see these as being analogs. I'm sure if I really sat down and compared them and read what a Wood Elf was, I could find them. But what I mean is, these are different. These are completely different. These live in our world.
Without doing it really loud on it. We'll see how that goes.
So,
sorry.
I feel like these are different enough where, like I said, as a GM, I would very much suggest that people used one of them if they wanted to be an elf, because it's going to make the backstory fit in a lot better if I'm running a game in Dragongrin.
And I also think that it immediately removes what can sometimes be I don't know, what's a nice way to put it?
Preconceived notions?
The training wheels.
Okay.
It's a way to remove the training wheels of some of these tropes.
Okay, yeah.
So yes, the preconceived notions is really what I'm saying, but you're in a better place sometimes as a player when you have to ask questions. Not necessarily having it as okay.
Because you might know a lot about High Elves, a lot more than is written in the book, whether it's, I wouldn't even say right or not, but you have
canonical.
Yeah, you have preconceived notions of what a High Elf is. When I think High Elf, I think, golden, very beautiful golden sort of robes and stuff, very tall, very like the elves in The Hobbit.
Sure.
To me, those are High Elves now. Those are actually Wood Elves, I guess. But that they're very just proper and posh. And I'm like, that's a High Elf to me.
Yeah.
But none of those, it doesn't say that here necessarily. It doesn't say that in the player's handbook, or not necessarily to that degree. But it's the sort of thing where ours may not be.
Right.
So I feel like even if we had done something as simple as taking the elves and renamed them and said where they come from, which is sort of what we did, but we're going to give them
different stats. Yeah, different mechanical advantages. And
even if the stats were the same, it would be different enough that you're like, hey, this is, we're, like you said, we're removing the tropes entirely. We're saying, hey, forget everything you know about High Elves. This is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Even if the name was just different.
Because I think the players are now going to have to ask questions.
Exactly.
That they can answer. That's the other thing about what we're calling Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrin, our campaign book, is that it's not about learning our history. It's about making your own in your own campaign. So we'll give you these linchpins, these anchor points. But I love that your player would go, oh, cool, mountain elves. Well, could I make them sort of based on real world Native Americans? And it's like, sure.
You're like, yeah, that's really cool.
Could I make them Norse? Sure, whatever you want. And there would be these different tribes. I think would be kind of cool. But yeah, that's what James and I are working on. That's what we've been plugging away at. So I'm glad that you're digging it.
Yeah,
and we did it for dwarves. I do need help with something real quick. We have a couple of minutes left. Can you help me with something?
A couple of minutes left, huh? Yeah.
Hi, buddy. So I wanted to do something different with the dwarves of Uldane.
Mm-hmm.
So Uldane dwarves would kind of be like mountain dwarves. There's this place where it's the northernmost region in our world that's marred by this magical storm called the Bleak. So it's basically just like hurricane season there all the time, but the hurricanes are arcane. So the Uldane are they're called soulstone dwarves, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can't think of a way to make this... I haven't decided on exactly how to make it manifest, but I thought it would be really cool if instead of aging, they slowly turn to stone over time.
Okay, yeah.
And the way to do that is some try to fight it, and I was thinking the ones that try to fight it, I wanted to work in somehow that they have to dig.
Mm-hmm.
Like, work in, why are dwarves always digging? It's not just because they're all greedy, but it's like, okay, well, some of them have to... And I don't want it to get too complicated, but I want it to be maybe like, well, they have to dig and find... They always have to find fresh earth to replenish themselves or something.
Well, no, I'm like, let's even go... I guess ask me your question first. Because
my question was going to be... that was kind of it. Like, how do you want to work it in there? Because I also think another facet would be, and hold your thought, some of them allow it to happen on purpose because they think it's a gracious way to age into becoming essentially a statue on purpose. Mm-hmm. And they don't have graveyards. They have these huge auditoriums. Well, it's just a bunch of statues, but I thought, it would be cool when stuff gets real and they need to. They have figured out an arcane way or even a different way to animate some of those statues to fight for them. So their ancestors fight.
I have an idea here, and I think you might hate it. But here's the thing.
Tell me.
I love this idea in this fantastical, crazy world that's just a thing they believe. That they believe they can slow the aging process if they get fresh earth. That they, it's a thing that happens. People live, people die, and they can't change that. But there are people that live their lives. There are dwarves that live their lives and don't try to lengthen their lives. They just continue living because they understand the way of things. But there are others that do try and find something, but there's not actually a wellspring or it's a belief they have. And,
do you know what it is?
You can tie it right to a deity, but
it's a home remedy.
Exactly.
You got to rub vinegar on that, and it'll make it better. It's
I love the idea. I love the idea that it's like you can spend your time doing that and hoping it makes a difference. And nobody knows. In the world, people wouldn't, it would be a fervent belief of theirs. It wouldn't be like, well, scientifically, we've disproven it.
Right. But you can't look at somebody and go, oh, you must have been digging. You look less stoned today.
Exactly. But it's the sort of thing where, like you said, some people accept it graciously and they don't. They just continue living and do their best, and try to live their lives without wasting any of the limited time they have trying to lengthen their lives.
I love that. I thought you were going to say that they don't actually turn to stone, they just think they are. I was like, I don't know if I want to go that real.
No, I love that they turn to stone. Because it basically it's a direct analog to how people get older. You get slower, you think less, you know what I mean? Like slowly you literally turn to stone until one day you turn to stone.
Right. Exactly.
That's like, I love
dust to dust. And I think that there would be a lot of cool options for they would also become the structures.
Oh, yeah.
Like pillars where there's a dwarf that's like, okay, and he starts holding something up and basically is like, all right, I'm ready to go now.
Exactly. And I really like those because it's ornamental, right. And another thing is this, I don't think this would be common knowledge to everyone. This would be like, oh, these dwarves make statues to all their dead. You know what I mean? It's like you don't.
Oh, it's a racial secret.
But people don't. The way
they don't believe it.
They don't believe it, and they don't. Humans or other people aren't walking around the
dwarven
graveyards, basically. Exactly.
Is this a real guy?
Exactly. It's the sort of thing where this happens. And there are certainly rumors and myths of it, but it's exactly what you said. I love the idea that they can come back. They can be brought back. And it's not something that they will do lightly.
Right.
That they want to do, but if stuff really goes down, a stone army friggin' marches from Uldane.
I love that.
And people are like, oh, wow, I guess it's true.
Yes, dude. And there's two things I immediately thought of. The first thing was, that would mean that dwarven households would have statues of their relatives.
Exactly.
They would be full of different, and like I'm saying, it would be a doorway, would be held up by your parents, that kind of stuff. Secondly, if a player fails their saving throws, their death saving throws, and dies, it happens immediately.
Oh yeah.
It's not just aging. I like the idea that when they die, if it's full death, they turn to stone.
Exactly. It's the same. It's not that they. Okay, so then let's rephrase it. It's not that they slowly turn to stone over their life. It's that when they die, they turn to stone. But because they're slowly turning to stone over their life. Do you see?
I do see what you're saying.
Where it's like...
Age does it slowly.
Exactly. It's not like, oh, well, I'm turning to stone slowly, but if that didn't happen, I wouldn't die.
Right.
It's like, no, I'm like, that's the effect of aging.
And there's got to be a breakout box about, like, what would be the equivalent of, like, leprosy.
Yeah.
Where, like, you get, like, stone rot or something, where it's you basically turn to stone quicker.
Exactly. And in the same respect, if they, I know that dwarves are very haughty people. Is that a word? They're very...
I would say they're very
strong.
proud, stalwart.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, no, I'm talking like resilient is the word.
Resilient, okay.
They're very resilient in the way that I think that, I don't know if racially they can't get diseases, but I think in some cases there are some they can't.
Poison.
But I guess what I'm saying is...
The lore of a dwarf is usually poison stuff. Like, you can't... You can, but it's tough.
So I guess what I mean to say is, it's the sort of thing where, like you said, they would have their ailments. But instead of like, they're going to die soon, it would be they're going to turn to stone soon.
Right. I love it. So anyway, that's kind of the direction we're going. So I think that it'll turn out well.
Yeah.
But that's what's got my mind share right now, is figuring these out and making sure that none of them get snowflakey for the sake of being snowflakey.
Yeah.
So, when you get to halflings, it's kind of like, okay, what are our halflings? And It can't just be like, well, I made 3 elves, so we got to, James, come on, we got to make 3 different halflings. It's like, I don't know. We want to make sure that the content is there and that each sub-race is merited its own spot in the book.
Yeah, because we're trying to add to the existing, rules and sort of things that people like about Dungeons and Dragons, but we don't want to try and replace every little thing.
Right.
Because, well, then we're basically just copying Dungeons and Dragons and saying play hours instead.
Exactly.
Like, we just want to give you a lot of tone and story and things to latch onto if you want to.
Yes. We're calling it an Atlas of Inspiration, this book. Well, cool. Well, I think we destroyed some artifacts today.
Yeah.
So this has been Destroy Artifacts. Be sure, if you're listening to this on YouTube, that you subscribe. We're going to try to do one of these a week, or at least a few a month. And if you are listening to this on iTunes or Podbean or whatever it is, if there is a subscribe option, great. But also, one of the things that really helps podcasts kind of get to the top of searches and things like that is reviews. So we would absolutely love it if you'd hop on iTunes and give us some reviews. Be honest, but be fair. And is there anything you want to say in closing? Or?
No, I think that was pretty good.
Awesome. Well, check us out on tabletopterrors.com. And until next time, may your dice roll high. Bye. Bye.